I stood at the back of the memorial ceremony, and I watched Owen's mother point at me in front of 200 people. "That's her," Paulette Blackwood said, her voice shaking, her finger stretched out toward me like an accusation all on its own. "That's the one who got my son killed." Nobody said anything back to her. Nobody looked at me either, not really. They just looked away, the way people do when they've already made up their minds about you and don't want to be caught agreeing out loud. I didn't say a word. What was I supposed to say? I'd been telling myself for a year that maybe she was right. Maybe I was the reason Owen wasn't standing here with the rest of us. Then I heard boots on gravel behind me, coming fast, and a voice I knew called out before I even turned around. "Mrs. Blackwood." Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Iverson stepped past me, holding a folder tight in one hand. "Before you say another word about this young woman, I need you to hear what your son actually did that night, because it's not what you think." ACT-1 Backstory. Okay, let me back up. I should tell you who I am first. My name is Callie Donovan. I'm a combat medic. I've been one for almost 9 years now, and I chose that job for one reason, and it's not a complicated one. When I was 14, my older brother Miles died in a car accident on a road I'd driven down 100 times since. I was in the car behind my dad's truck when it happened. I watched the whole thing. I couldn't do anything. I was just a kid standing on the side of the road, screaming, while grown adults tried to save him and couldn't. I think about that moment more than I think about almost anything else in my life. Not because I want to, just because it's stuck there, somewhere behind my ribs, and it never really leaves. So when I turned 18, I didn't go to college like everyone expected. I enlisted. I told the recruiter I wanted to be a medic, and he asked me why, and I just said, because next time, I want to know what to do. That was it. That was the whole reason. I never really explained it any better than that, not even to myself. My mom didn't understand it at first. She wanted me to go to school, live a normal life, put some distance between myself and everything that happened on that road. I think she worried the Army would just put me back in situations where I'd watch people get hurt and not be able to help, over and over, like some kind of punishment I was choosing for myself. I told her it was the opposite. I told her every time I learned something new, every skill, every certification, it felt like paying off a debt I owed to a 14-year-old kid standing on the side of a road, screaming. She didn't fully get it, but she stopped arguing with me about it, eventually, and she came to every graduation and every ceremony after that, standing near the back the way moms do, proud and worried in equal amounts. I met Owen Blackwood 5 years ago, at a training course neither of us really wanted to be at. It was hot, it was long, and everybody was tired and cranky. Except him. He was the one guy in the whole class who still had a joke ready every time something went wrong. I remember thinking, this guy's either an idiot or he's the only sane person here. Turns out it was a little of both. He was a ranger. Good one too, everybody said so. But what I remember most isn't his job. It's the way he listened. When I told him about Miles, months into knowing him, he didn't try to fix it. He didn't say anything about how sorry he was, or how it wasn't my fault. All the things people usually say. He just sat there with me for a long time, quiet, and then he said, "You didn't fail him, you were 14. And somehow, hearing him say it like that, so simple, so plain, it helped more than anything else anyone had ever told me. I think that's the thing I fell in love with first, honestly. Not the jokes, though those helped. It was the quiet. The way he could sit in a hard silence with somebody, instead of rushing to fill it with something easier. I'd dated a couple of guys before him who couldn't handle it when I got quiet, who needed me to explain myself or reassure them I was fine, even when I wasn't. Owen never needed that. He just stayed. We got married 2 years after that. Small wedding, his parents came, but I always felt something off with them, even then. Paulette was polite to me, but it was the kind of polite that feels more like a test. You're being watched to see if you'll pass. Harlan, Owen's dad, was a retired Command Sergeant Major, and he had opinions about everything, especially about what kind of woman his son should have married. I don't think I was ever quite it, in his mind. Owen used to tell me not to worry about it. Give them time, he'd say. They'll come around. They never really did. Not before what happened. And honestly, not for a long time after either. I want to tell you a little more about those early years, because I think it matters for what comes later. Harlan wasn't a mean man, not in an obvious way. He was just used to running things a certain way, and he'd spent 30 years in the army being right about a lot of things, which I think made it hard for him to imagine he might be wrong about something as simple as reading a person. He looked at me and saw a young medic who'd married his son fast, and he built a whole opinion out of that one fact and never really let it change. Paulette was different, quieter about it. She'd ask me questions at dinner that always felt like they were leading somewhere, like she was gathering evidence for a case she hadn't quite decided how to argue yet. I used to go home after those visits and just sit in the car for a few minutes before I could make myself drive off. Owen would apologize every time, and every time I'd tell him it was fine, because it felt easier than admitting how much it actually got to me. I remember one Thanksgiving, maybe our second one together, when Harlan spent almost the whole meal talking about a young captain he used to serve with, someone he clearly thought would have made a better match for his son than me. He didn't say it outright. He didn't have to. Owen caught my eye from across the table and gave me this little look, like he was sorry and embarrassed all at once, and I just smiled back at him and finished my dinner. Because that's what you learn to do in a family that never quite lets you all the way in. Owen and I ended up in the same unit for a rotation, which almost never happens, but it did for us. I was the medic attached to his platoon. It felt like some kind of gift at the time, getting to be close to him during a deployment, instead of just writing letters and hoping. I didn't know yet that it would also put me in the middle of the worst night of my life. We were about 7 months into that deployment when things changed. I found out I was pregnant. I hadn't told anyone yet. Not the command, not my own platoon sergeant, nobody. I was still trying to figure out how to even say the words out loud. I told Owen first, obviously. I remember how still his face went when I told him. Not scared, not even really shocked, just still. Like something in him had gone quiet and serious all at once. He held my hands and said, Okay, we'll figure it out. And then, real quiet, almost like he was talking to himself more than me, he said, I'm not gonna let anything happen to you. Not now. I didn't think much of that at the time. People say things like that. You don't always know they mean it in a way that's about to matter more than you realize. Looking back now, I remember little things from those 2 weeks that felt normal at the time and feel different now. Owen started checking the maps a little more carefully before we headed out on anything. He asked our platoon sergeant more questions than usual about routes and positions, small things that nobody thought twice about, because that's just what a good ranger does anyway. I didn't put any of it together until much later, until I understood what he must have already been carrying around in his head, quiet, the whole time, without telling me. He also started writing more letters home than usual, which I noticed but didn't ask about. I figured he just missed his parents more than he usually let on, which would have made sense given everything with the pregnancy. I never imagined he was writing the kind of letter you write when you're not totally sure you'll get another chance to say something. ACT-2, the incident. 2 weeks after I told him, our platoon got sent out on a routine movement between 2 outposts. Nothing that should have been complicated. I was riding with the lead element because one of the younger guys had come down with heat exhaustion earlier that day, and somebody needed to be close in case anything else went sideways. Halfway through the movement, our lead vehicle hit something. I still don't love talking about the details, so I'll just say it was bad, and it happened fast, and for about 10 seconds, nobody really knew what was happening or who was hurt. What I do know, because people told me afterward, piece by piece, over weeks, is that Owen wasn't supposed to be near my position at all. His job that day had him further back in the formation. But somehow, in the seconds right after the first explosion, before the second one hit, he was suddenly right beside me, pulling me down and back, away from where I'd been standing. The second explosion caught the space I'd just been in, not him. Me, except by the time it went off, he was the one standing there instead of me, because he'd swapped our positions without anyone telling him to. He didn't make it. I did. I don't remember a lot of what happened right after that. I remember waking up in a field hospital 2 days later, and I remember a chaplain sitting beside my bed before anyone else did, which is never a good sign. I remember finding out I'd lost the pregnancy too, somewhere in all of it, though the doctors were never fully sure if it was from the blast or the stress of everything after. That's a loss I still haven't fully found words for even now telling you this. What I didn't expect, not for 1 second, was what happened once the official report came out. Because Owen hadn't been assigned to my position, because he'd left his own post without being told to, Because the official report, in its dry, careful language, said the incident happened during an unplanned repositioning of personnel, without explaining why that repositioning happened or who it happened for. People filled in that blank however they wanted, and most people filled it in with me. Rumors started moving through the unit almost immediately, that I'd called him over, that I'd panicked and pulled him out of position without thinking, that my own carelessness got a good man killed. Nobody said it to my face at first. I just started noticing people getting quiet whenever I walked into a room, conversations stopping a half-second too late for me not to notice. I want to say something honest here, because I think it matters. Some part of me started believing the rumors too, not because I remembered doing anything wrong, but because grief has a way of making you doubt everything, even your own memory of the worst night of your life. I'd lie awake going over those 10 seconds again and again, trying to find the version where I did something, said something, that pulled him toward me, instead of him choosing it on his own. I never found that version, but I kept looking for it anyway, mostly because the alternative, that he simply chose to save me, felt too big to hold on to without some kind of proof. I stopped going to unit gatherings after a while. It got easier to just stay home, work my shifts, and avoid the quiet that settled over every room I walked into. A couple of people from the platoon still checked on me now and then, but even they seemed careful around me, like they weren't sure what to say or how much to ask. Then it reached his family, and once it reached his family, it stopped being quiet at all. Harlan called me 2 weeks after the funeral and told me, flat out, that he blamed me, that he'd read enough of these reports over his own career to know what unplanned repositioning really meant, and in his mind, it meant somebody made a bad call, and that somebody was me. Paulette wouldn't speak to me at all after that, except through short, cold messages asking me to stop reaching out. The one-year memorial ceremony for Owen's unit came around, and I almost didn't go. Part of me wanted to. Part of me needed to stand somewhere and just be near his name being said out loud. So I went. I stood at the back, in my dress uniform, trying to just get through it quietly. The ceremony started the way these things always do, with a chaplain, a folded flag, a table set up with photographs of the men from the unit who didn't come home. I stood near the back row, close enough to see Owen's picture from where I was standing, far enough that I wouldn't have to look anyone in the eye if I didn't want to. A few people from the platoon nodded at me as they walked past, careful nods, the kind you give somebody when you're not totally sure how to act around them anymore. That's when Paulette saw me, and that's when she stood up, in front of 200 people, and pointed right at me, and said the words I'd been dreading hearing out loud for an entire year. That's her. That's the one who got my son killed. I stood there and let it happen. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I think some part of me had already decided, somewhere over that year, that maybe she was right, and I didn't have it in me anymore to fight a grief that big. The silence after she said it felt like it lasted forever, though it probably only lasted a few seconds. Nobody moved to correct her. Nobody moved to comfort me either. I just stood there, feeling every eye in that crowd land on me at once, the same way I'd felt eyes on me at that funeral a year earlier, except this time there was no colonel walking up the aisle to save me from it. Not yet, anyway. What I didn't know, standing there, was that somebody else in that crowd had spent the last 2 weeks reading through Owen's personal effects, his last letters home, and a witness statement that had never made it into the official report at all. CT3, The Reckoning. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Iverson had been Owen's company commander for 3 years. I knew him, but not well. Enough to nod to in passing, not enough to expect him to walk into that ceremony and change my life the way he did. He came up fast behind me, holding a folder, and he didn't wait for anyone to introduce him or explain why he was interrupting. He just walked straight past me and stood right in front of Paulette. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, "before you say another word about this young woman, I need you to hear what your son actually did that night. Because it's not what you think." The whole place went quiet. I mean completely quiet. The kind where you can hear people breathing. He opened the folder. 2 weeks ago, he said, a command review reopened the incident report from that night, because a piece of evidence surfaced that hadn't been included the first time around. A written statement from one of Owen's own soldiers, someone who saw what really happened in those last seconds and never got asked the right questions the first time around. He read from the statement. A young soldier, one of Owen's own guys, had seen Owen leave his position and move toward mine before the second explosion. Not because I called him, not because anything went wrong that needed fixing. He moved because he saw where the second device was likely to be, based on the pattern of the first blast, and he made a decision, in about 2 seconds, to put himself where I was standing and put me where he'd just been. I remember trying to picture it while he read that part out loud. Owen, standing somewhere behind me, watching the first blast go off, working out in his head, faster than should even be possible, where the next one was probably coming from, and then just moving. No hesitation, no stopping to think about what it might cost him. I'd spent a year imagining every version of that night except the one that was actually true, mostly because the true version was so much bigger than anything I'd let myself believe about why he'd been standing there at all. "There's more," Colonel Iverson said, and his voice got quieter here, like even he wasn't totally sure he had the right to say this part out loud. Owen wrote a letter to his parents about 2 weeks before that night. He never sent it. It was found among his things during the review. He looked at me for a second before he kept going. In it, he told them Callie was pregnant. He told them he hadn't told anyone else yet, not even his own command, because they wanted a little more time before making it official. And he wrote that, if anything ever happened to him over there, he wanted them to know one thing, that protecting her wasn't a decision he'd have to think twice about, that she and the baby mattered more to him than anything else in that uniform. I heard somebody behind me start crying. I think it might have been me. He read a little more from the letter after that, parts I still can't fully repeat without my voice breaking, parts about how Owen described the two of us together, about the little life we hadn't even told his own command about yet. He wrote that he wasn't scared for himself out there. Not really, not anymore, not since finding out. He said his only fear was something happening to me before he got the chance to come home and actually be a father, and that if he ever had to choose between himself and me in some split second that didn't leave room for thinking, there wouldn't be a choice at all. It would already be decided. Colonel Iverson turned back to Paulette. "Your son didn't die because of a mistake anyone made that night," he said. "He died because he made a choice, in less than 2 seconds, to protect his wife and his unborn child. And he never got the chance to tell either of you why, because he was saving that letter for a day he never expected to actually need it." Harlan had come up beside his wife by then, and I watched his whole face change, piece by piece, like something heavy was settling into place behind his eyes. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he looked at me, really looked at me, maybe for the first time since I'd known him. "I read those reports for 30 years, he said, quiet now. Nothing like the voice he'd used on the phone with me 2 weeks after the funeral. I should have asked more questions before I decided what one of them meant. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to tell him it was fine, the way I always used to smooth things over at those uncomfortable family dinners. But another part of me, a part I didn't recognize right away, just stood there and let the silence sit instead of rushing to fill it for him. I think that was the first time in our whole relationship I didn't try to make things easier for Harlan Blackwood. Colonel Iverson told the crowd the official record was being corrected, that the finding was being changed from an unplanned repositioning to a documented act of protective action under fire, and that Owen's file would reflect the truth of what he did and why he did it. He said the review board had also confirmed there was no fault on my part, none at all, in anything that happened that night. He turned to me one more time before he closed the folder. "I should have pushed harder for this the first time around," he said. "I read that report when it first came out, and something about it never sat right with me. I just didn't have the piece that was missing yet. I'm sorry it took a year to find it. I didn't say anything. I don't think I could have, even if I'd tried. I just stood there in the quiet that followed, holding on to the only thing that mattered in that moment, which was finally not being the person everyone thought I was." A few people from the crowd came up to me afterward, some of them people who'd gone quiet around me for the whole year, apologizing in small, awkward ways, the kind of apologies people give when they're embarrassed about how easily they believed the worst. I didn't hold it against them, not really. I understood, better than most, how easy it is to fill in a blank with whatever story feels most convenient, especially when the truth is harder to sit with. ACT 4. After the corrected report went into Owen's permanent file about a month later, his name is remembered now the way it should have been from the start, as a soldier who made a choice to protect the people he loved, not as the center of some vague, unexplained mistake. Paulette called me 2 weeks after the ceremony. It was a short call. She cried through most of it, and so did I, and neither of us really managed full sentences. But she said she was sorry, and she meant it, and that was enough of a start for both of us. Harlan drove out to see me a month after that, alone, no warning, just showed up at my door on a Saturday morning. He stood on my porch for a long minute before he said anything. Then he told me he wanted to hear about the man his son actually was. Not the version he'd built up in his own head out of grief and old habits and 30 years of reading reports that never told the whole story. We sat on my porch for 3 hours that day. It was the first real conversation we'd ever had. He asked me questions I never expected from him. What Owen was like on deployment, whether he was scared, whether he ever talked about the future we'd been planning. I told him about the joke Owen made at that training course all those years ago, the one that made me think he was either an idiot or the only sane person in the room. Harlan laughed at that, a real laugh, not the polite kind he usually gave me at family dinners. He said Owen used to make that same kind of joke as a teenager, right in the middle of some family disaster, just to get everybody to breathe again. I never knew that about him. It felt like getting a small piece of Owen back that I hadn't even known I was missing. We sat there long enough that the coffee I made him went cold twice, and neither of us noticed until the sun had moved halfway across the sky. It's strange, looking back, how much easier it was to talk to him once neither of us had anything left to prove to the other. Before he left that day, Harlan told me he was sorry for something else too, something I hadn't expected him to bring up at all. He said he realized, sitting there listening to me talk about his son, that he'd spent years deciding I wasn't good enough for Owen, without ever really trying to know me first. He said it wasn't fair, and he wished he'd figured that out a long time before he needed a corrected report to convince him. I still think about the baby I lost that night. That part doesn't get fixed by a corrected report, or an apology from people who blamed me for a year. Some grief just sits with you, quiet, permanent, and you learn to carry it rather than solve it. But I don't carry it alone anymore. Not the way I did that year. Everyone thought I was the reason Owen was gone. Colonel Iverson checks in every few months. Just a short call, nothing formal about it. He told me once that reading Owen's letter was one of the hardest things he'd done in 30 years of service, and that he was glad, at least, he got to be the one who finally told the truth instead of letting somebody else's silence keep deciding the story. The young soldier whose statement changed everything, a kid named Corporal Nixon, who couldn't have been more than 20 at the time, reached out to me a few months back. He told me he'd carried guilt of his own, wondering if he should have said something sooner, wondering if his silence had cost me a year of grief I shouldn't have had to carry. I told him what Owen once told me, the only thing that ever really helped. I told him he didn't fail anybody. He was young and scared, and he told the truth as soon as somebody finally asked him the right questions. He wrote me a longer letter after that first message, telling me more about that night than I'd ever let myself ask anyone before. He said Owen didn't hesitate for even a second, didn't look scared, didn't pause to think it over. He just moved. Corporal Nixon said watching that happen, watching a grown man make a decision that fast without any doubt in it at all, changed something in how he thought about the job ever since. He said he thinks about it every time he's scared now, and it helps him move anyway. I got promoted not long after all this settled, to Sergeant First Class. It had nothing to do with any of it, really. Just years of work finally catching up with a board result. But I remember standing there getting my new rank pinned on, thinking about how Owen would have made some joke about it, something that would have made the whole ceremony feel less serious than it was trying to be. Paulette came to that promotion ceremony, actually. She stood near the back, the same spot I used to stand in, and afterward she hugged me for the first time since the wedding. She didn't say much. She just held on a little longer than a normal hug usually lasts, and I understood what she meant by it without needing the words. I keep his unsent letter now, the one Colonel Iverson found, in a small box beside our wedding photo. I've read it more times than I probably should admit. Every time, I get to that last line again, the one where he says protecting me wasn't a decision he'd have to think twice about, and every time, it still catches me somewhere in the chest, same as the first time I heard it read out loud in front of 200 people who'd finally stopped looking away. Some nights I sit outside and just breathe for a minute before I go back in. I don't know how else to describe it. It's not sadness anymore. Not really. It's something quieter than that. Something more like gratitude. mixed in with everything else that never really goes away. I visit Owen's grave most weekends now, sometimes with Harlan and Paulette, sometimes alone. I bring Miles into those visits too, in my own quiet way, talking to both of them like they can somehow hear me, telling them about my week, about work, about small things that probably don't matter to anyone but me. I used to think grief was something you eventually finished. I don't believe that anymore. I think you just learn how to carry it without it crushing you flat, one ordinary day at a time. Sometimes I bring flowers. Sometimes I just sit on the grass and talk out loud for a while, not caring how it looks to anyone passing by. I tell Owen about the porch conversations with his dad, about Paulette's photo albums, about the young medic in my unit who reminds me of myself. I like to think he'd get a kick out of how much has changed between his parents and me, given how hard those early years were. He always did believe they'd come around eventually. I guess he was right about that too, even if it took something this hard to get us there. There's a younger medic in my unit now, fresh out of training, who reminds me a little of myself back when I first started. She asked me once why I chose this job, and I found myself telling her the whole story. Miles and the road and the 14-year-old kid who couldn't do anything but scream. She listened the way Owen used to listen. Quiet, not rushing to fix anything. Just letting the story sit there in the space between us. When I finished, she didn't say she was sorry, or that it wasn't my fault. All the things people usually say. She just nodded and said, "That makes sense." And somehow that landed better than any bigger reaction would have. I think about Owen every single day, obviously, but it's not always the heavy kind of thinking anymore. Sometimes it's small things. A joke he would have made, a song that used to come on in his truck, the exact way he laughed at his own bad jokes before anyone else even had a chance to react. Grief changes shape over time, I've learned. It doesn't get smaller, not really, but it stops being the only shape in the room. Other things start fitting in around it. Gratitude, small joy, even a little bit of peace, on the good days. Paulette and I talk almost every week now. She sends me photos sometimes, old ones of Owen as a kid, ones I'd never seen before, ones that show me a whole version of him I never got the chance to meet myself. I've started keeping a small album just for those photos, next to the box with his unsent letter, a quiet record of the boy who grew into the man who saved my life without a second of doubt in him. Harlan retired from the Veterans Support Board he used to sit on last spring, and he asked me, of all people, to take his seat instead. I told him I wasn't sure I was the right person for it, given everything, and he told me I was the right person, more than anyone else he could think of, because of everything. I said yes. It felt like something Owen would have wanted. Two people who used to barely speak to each other, now sitting on the same side of something that mattered. Corporal Nixon, the young soldier who saw everything and finally said so, still texts me every once in a while. Small things. Nothing heavy. A photo of his own kid. A dumb joke he thinks Owen would have liked. I think we both understand something about each other now that's hard to explain to anyone else. What it feels like to carry a piece of that night around, and what it feels like when somebody finally believes you enough to let some of that weight go. Some people ask me if I'm angry at Paulette and Harlan for the year they spent blaming me. I used to be. For a while, I held on to that anger pretty tight, because it felt like the only thing keeping me upright some days. But anger like that gets heavy after a while, heavier than grief even, and eventually, I realized I didn't want to carry both. So I let one of them go. Not all the hurt, just the anger part. The rest of it, I think, just becomes part of the story now. The hard chapter that came before the truth finally showed up. I think about how close I came to never getting that truth at all. If Colonel Iverson hadn't gone looking, if Corporal Nixon had stayed quiet a little longer, if Owen hadn't written that letter and just kept everything locked up inside himself the way a lot of soldiers do, I might still be standing at the back of every ceremony, letting people believe whatever version of that night felt easiest to them. It scares me a little, thinking about it that way. How much of the truth in this world depends on somebody deciding to keep looking, even after everyone else has already stopped. That's part of why I don't mind telling this story now, even the hard parts. Somebody out there might be carrying blame that isn't actually theirs to carry, waiting on a truth that hasn't found its way to them yet. I want them to know it's worth waiting for. It's worth holding on a little longer, even on the days it feels impossible. If this story got to you, leave one word in the comments. Just one word, the one that comes to mind when you think about what it really means to protect somebody. Callie never asked anybody to clear her name. She just carried the blame quietly, the way a lot of us do, because speaking up felt harder than staying silent. But sometimes the truth finds its way out anyway, through a letter that almost never got read, through a young soldier who finally said what he saw, through a commander who cared enough to go looking for it. And if this story reminded you that love sometimes shows up in the quietest, fastest decisions, the ones made in a second and meant for a lifetime, subscribe. Because tomorrow, I'm telling you about the say thought the soldier left nothing behind. Then one final decision changed everything. I'll see you there.